What happens when a young man born into a political dynasty walks into a courtroom believing his uncle's seat in the United States Senate makes him entirely bulletproof? This young man arrived in my courtroom with absolute certainty that his family's influence would completely sanitize what he had done. That money, legacy connections, and a phalanx of $1,000-an-hour defense attorneys could make the stolen life savings of 4 elderly combat veterans simply evaporate into a manageable, quiet misunderstanding. He stood before my bench, looking at the proceedings as though they were a minor administrative hurdle he was merely tolerating. And he whispered to his lead counsel, with a smirk that communicated a lifetime of inherited immunity, "My uncle is making a call right now. This will be dismissed by lunch." The room went dead, silent. But what no one in that courtroom understood, what he himself did not know, was that Senator Robert Sterling was seated in the very back row, in a dark overcoat, far out of the view of the press cameras. He was watching his nephew dismantle the very honor his family had spent 3 generations building. And the decision the senator was about to make would break hearts, restore a city's faith in justice, and demonstrate that true patriots love their country's principles more than they love shielding their bloodline from the consequences of their worst sins. It was a damp Thursday morning, and I was preparing for what the docket suggested was a high-stakes financial fraud case. In my decades on this bench, I have presided over thousands of matters, from the trivial to the profoundly tragic, but something about this specific file made my jaw clench before I had even turned to the second page. The victims were Arthur Vance, Thomas Greco, Henry Miller, and James Wright, 4 men in their late 80s, all decorated combat veterans who had survived wars only to be financially gutted on their own soil. The defendant was 29-year-old Julian Sterling, nephew of Senator Robert Sterling, one of the most entrenched and powerful political figures in the country. The case file presented a sequence of events that communicated a predatory cruelty I rarely see. Over the course of 14 months, Julian Sterling had run a fraudulent veterans housing initiative. He weaponized his family's prestigious name to gain the absolute trust of these elderly men, convincing them to drain their retirement accounts and sign over the deeds to their modest homes under the guise of a high-yield investment fund designed exclusively to help disabled veterans. He took everything they had, every cent meant for their grandchildren, every dollar saved for their final medical care. By the time my courtroom doors opened that morning, the gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder. Reporters filled the press boxes, their cameras waiting for a spectacle. In the front row behind the prosecution sat the 4 veterans. They were wearing their faded Legion caps, their posture still carrying the rigid, quiet dignity of men who knew exactly what duty and sacrifice meant. There was a heavy energy in that room, a current running just beneath the surface of the murmurs, and it told me before a single word was spoken that this day was going to carry immense weight. And then the doors swung open, and Julian Sterling walked in. He moved with the calculated, expensive grace of someone who had never once faced a consequence he couldn't pay to dissolve. Behind him trailed 2 attorneys, men in charcoal suits, who looked like they were auditioning for a role in a legal thriller, carrying leather portfolios that were surely more for show than for law. Julian surveyed the packed courtroom with an expression of weary, mild annoyance, as if being here was an insult to his schedule. He didn't glance at the veterans in the front row. He didn't acknowledge the 4 men whose lives he had systematically dismantled. He simply walked to the defense table, smoothed his hair, and looked at me with the eyes of a boy who had spent his entire life being told he was untouchable. I let the room settle. I allowed the silence to stretch, to become heavy. I guard my reputation for absolute impartiality with every ounce of my being, but I will tell you plainly that by the time Julian Sterling sat down and checked his watch, my patience had already begun its retreat. I had read the file. I had looked at the bank records, the offshore accounts, the forged signatures, the sheer, calculated coldness of the fraud. I knew exactly who he was. "Bailiff, please read the charges," I said, my voice deliberately measured. The clerk stood. "Your Honor, the defendant, Julian Sterling, is charged with 4 counts of felony financial fraud, 2 counts of identity theft, and 1 count of criminal conspiracy to defraud protected veterans." I turned my gaze to the defense table. Julian didn't even look up at the clerk. He was busy adjusting his cufflinks. "Mr. Sterling," I said, the sharpness of my tone cutting through the hum of the courtroom, "you are facing life-altering consequences. I suggest you pay attention." His lead attorney, a man whose skin looked like it had been polished with premium wax, rose immediately. "Your Honor, we enter a plea of not guilty. Furthermore, my client maintains that this is a colossal misunderstanding, a series of administrative errors blown out of proportion by the media and a disgruntled group of investors who clearly don't understand the complexities of modern wealth management. The courtroom let out a collective, sharp gasp. The audacity of the statement calling combat veterans who had been robbed of their life savings disgruntled investors rippled through the room like a physical shockwave. One of the veterans in the front row, Arthur Vance, gripped his cane so tightly his knuckles turned white. I set my pen down slowly. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the bench. "Counselor," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "you have exactly 10 seconds to sit down before I find you in contempt for insulting the intelligence of this court, and more importantly, the dignity of the men sitting in the front row." The attorney paled, his confidence evaporating in the face of my glare. He sat. I turned my attention to Julian. He was no longer adjusting his cufflinks. The weight of the room was finally beginning to press against his manufactured arrogance. "Mr. Sterling," I said, "these men are not disgruntled investors. They are the foundation of this country's history. You didn't make an administrative error. You robbed them." Julian cleared his throat, his composure faltering just enough for me to see the fear beneath the surface. He looked toward the back of the room, as if expecting his uncle to materialize and whisk him away. I looked at the back row. Senator Robert Sterling sat motionless, his face a mask of iron, watching his nephew. "Is the prosecution prepared to present the evidence?" I asked. "Yes, Your Honor," the assistant district attorney replied, his voice firm. "We have the wire transfer records, the recorded phone calls where the defendant explicitly tells his associates to bleed them dry before they realize what's happening, and the forged power of attorney documents." I nodded. "Proceed. And I suggest the defense prepare themselves, because this will not be a pleasant morning for your client." I looked at Julian. He looked small. The courtroom was finally seeing him for what he was, not a political prodigy, but a common thief. But I knew the game he was playing. He still thought the phone call would come. He still thought his name was a shield. He hadn't realized yet that the shield had been shattered. The ADA stepped up to the podium, his posture rigid. "Your Honor, the prosecution will now present Exhibit A, a series of intercepted emails and recorded phone conversations from the defendant's private cloud server. These aren't just administrative errors, Your Honor. This is a masterclass in predatory deception." I signaled for the audio to be played. The courtroom went silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy in the chest. Julian Sterling's voice filled the room, clear and chillingly arrogant. "Look," the recording began, Julian laughing. "The old guy, Vance? He thinks the Veterans Housing Initiative is actually going to build him a porch. He's signing over his life savings because he thinks he's helping the younger generation. It's pathetic. Once the funds hit the Cayman account, we'll move the goalposts. By the time they realize the foundation was never poured, I'll be on a flight to Zurich." On the audio, his associate laughed. "And the senator?" Julian's response was immediate, dripping with entitlement. "My uncle? He's busy playing statesman in D.C. He has no idea what I'm doing, and even if he did, he wouldn't touch this. My name is the only reason these guys even open their checkbooks. I'm just cashing in on the family brand. It's a victimless crime, really. They were going to die with that money in a mattress anyway." A collective gasp swept through the gallery, followed by an indignant roar that the bailiffs had to immediately suppress. I didn't gavel it down. I wanted them to hear it. I wanted the sound of that cold-blooded greed to echo off the walls. I turned my eyes to the front row. The 4 veterans were sitting in absolute stillness. Arthur Vance, the man who had been called pathetic by this boy, looked up at the bench. His eyes weren't filled with tears. They were filled with the steely, hardened resolve of a man who had stared down enemy fire in a dozen different conflicts. Julian Sterling, however, had turned a sickly shade of gray. His arrogance had not just faltered, it had completely disintegrated. He looked toward the back of the courtroom again. But this time, he didn't look for reassurance. He was looking for a rescue that wasn't coming. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel, "you referred to these men as pathetic. You referred to the robbery of their life savings as a victimless crime. Do you stand by those statements under oath?" His lead attorney jumped up, frantic. "Your Honor, the defendant is under no obligation to." "Sit down," I ordered, not even looking at him. I stared straight at Julian. "I am asking your client, Mr. Sterling, do you believe these men are pathetic?" Julian swallowed hard. His expensive suit suddenly seemed 2 sizes too big. He looked at Arthur Vance, then back at me. I was speaking in a private capacity, Your Honor. It was a joke among friends. A joke, I repeated, the word tasting like bile. You defrauded men who gave their youth to this country, who lived through the horrors of war, so that you could exist in a world where you have the luxury of being a predator as a hobby. You didn't just steal their money, Mr. Sterling. You stole their dignity. You stole their security. I gestured to the audio equipment. The court has heard enough to establish the intent. The defense has no argument against the mountain of paper trails and the defendant's own words. But I am not satisfied with the prosecution's pace. I want the full forensic audit of the offshore accounts by tomorrow morning. If there is 1 cent hidden, I will ensure the maximum sentencing guidelines are not just met, but exceeded. The courtroom felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of it. The senator in the back row shifted. For the first time, he leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly over his cane. He wasn't watching the press. He was watching me, and he was watching his nephew with a look of profound, quiet disappointment that I knew, with absolute certainty, would be the most painful thing Julian Sterling would ever experience. The courtroom, already stifling with tension, grew vacuum-sealed as Julian Sterling's lead attorney, Mr. Miller, stood up. He smoothed his blazer, his face a roadmap of calculated anxiety. He could smell the desperation rising from his client. He approached the bench, his voice dropping to a theatrical, conspiratorial whisper, meant only for me. Your Honor, may we approach? Given the inflammatory nature of the exhibits presented, my client would like to discuss a potential plea agreement. He is prepared to make full restitution immediately if the prosecution is willing to drop the felony charges to misdemeanors. He is, after all, a young man with a bright future, and this has clearly been a misunderstanding of intent. I stared at him. The sheer gall required to ask for a reduction to a misdemeanor after ruining the lives of 4 men was breathtaking. I didn't lean in. I didn't soften my gaze. I looked at the veterans in the front row, men who had seen the worst of humanity and had somehow kept their faith, and then I looked back at Miller. Mr. Miller, I said, my voice projecting clearly into the microphones so the entire gallery could hear, you are asking me to barter justice for the convenience of your client's bright future. You are asking me to weigh the life savings of 4 men against the reputation of a young man who viewed them as nothing more than prey. The answer is no. Julian slumped in his chair, the color draining from his face. It was the moment the armor finally failed. He realized that the money, the connections, and the name meant absolutely nothing here. But just as I reached for my gavel to demand the prosecution continue, a movement in the back of the courtroom froze the air. Senator Robert Sterling stood up. He didn't stand with the bluster of a politician. He stood with the slow, deliberate gravity of a man who had finally reached the end of his tether. The bailiffs hesitated, unsure whether to intervene, but he ignored them. He walked down the center aisle, the heavy wooden floor creaking under his steps, the only sound in the room. He didn't look at his nephew. He didn't look at the press. He looked at me, his eyes tired, deeply etched with the pain of a man who was about to lose everything he had spent 30 years building. He reached the front of the courtroom and stood beside the prosecution's table, turning to face his own family member. Julian looked up, his lips trembling, eyes wide with a frantic, silent plea for help. Uncle Robert, he whispered, a sound so faint it barely carried across the room. The senator didn't respond to him. He addressed the court, his voice gravelly and stripped of its usual senatorial polish. Your Honor, he began, and the room seemed to stop rotating. My name is Robert Sterling. I have sat in this courtroom and watched the evidence. I have seen the records. I have listened to my own blood call. These men, these heroes, pathetic. I have spent my career talking about the law, about the sanctity of our nation's values, but I have failed to instill those values in my own home. He turned finally to look at Julian, not with anger, but with a profound, terrifying pity. I am not here to intervene, Your Honor. I am here to tell you that any call made from my office in the last 24 hours regarding this case was made without my knowledge or consent. I am withdrawing all support. My nephew is an adult. He has committed an unforgivable act, and he must face the full, unadulterated weight of the law. The gallery erupted, a roar of shock and disbelief. Even the stenographer stopped typing, her hands hovering in the air. Julian Sterling looked as if he had been struck physically. The senator had not just abandoned him, he had dismantled his last line of defense. The room was no longer just a courtroom. It was a stage where the currency of power had suddenly lost all of its value. The silence that followed Senator Sterling's exit was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and filled with the collective realization of those present that Julian Sterling was, for the first time in his 29 years, entirely alone. His lead attorney, Miller, looked as though he had just been told his license was being revoked. He shuffled his papers, his hands shaking, no longer looking at me with the rehearsed confidence he'd displayed 10 minutes prior. He realized, as did everyone in the room, that the political capital he had banked on to intimidate this court had just been withdrawn and the check he was holding had bounced. Julian Sterling had stopped trying to look bored. He was staring at the empty seat where his uncle had stood, his face a ghostly, panicked mask. He looked like a child who had just realized his parents were not coming to pick him up from school. I waited. I didn't rush him. I wanted the full weight of that isolation to sink into his bones. I wanted him to understand that in this courtroom, he wasn't a senator's nephew, he wasn't a dynasty scion, he was a defendant who had looked at 4 men who had bled for their country and decided their sacrifice was a business opportunity. "Mr. Miller," I said, breaking the quiet that had stretched on for a full minute, "are you planning on calling a witness, or are you waiting for a ghost to testify on your client's behalf?" Miller cleared his throat, his voice cracking. "Your Honor, the defense would like a recess to consult with our client." "Denied," I said flatly. "The court is in session. Prosecution, call your first witness." The assistant district attorney didn't hesitate. The state calls Arthur Vance to the stand. The courtroom watched as Arthur Vance stood up. He was a small man, his frame stooped by age and the weight of memories he rarely spoke of. He walked to the witness stand with the help of a silver-headed cane, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of the rubber tip against the floorboards the only sound in the room. Every eye was on him, not out of pity, but out of a sudden, sharp reverence. When he sat, he adjusted his Legion cap with trembling, gnarled fingers. He was sworn in, his voice raspy but steady, carrying the authority of a man who had seen the world at its worst and still expected it to be better. "Mr. Vance," the ADA began, his voice lowered out of respect, "can you tell the court in your own words what Julian Sterling promised you when he approached you about the Veterans Housing Initiative?" Arthur leaned into the microphone. He didn't look at the lawyers. He looked directly at Julian. Julian tried to meet his gaze, but he couldn't. He shifted in his seat, desperately studying his own fingernails. "He told me," Arthur began, his voice gathering strength, "that he was the grandson of a man who served in the same unit as my own father. He told me that he had a responsibility, a debt, he called it, to ensure that men like me, who had given their youth to the service, wouldn't have to worry about the future. He spoke about honor. He spoke about legacy. I believed him, not because of his money, but because I thought he was a man who understood what it meant to hold a promise sacred." Arthur paused, a flicker of pain crossing his features. When the checks stopped clearing and the housing project turned out to be a shell company for his own personal expenses, it wasn't just the money, Your Honor. It was the realization that he had weaponized my own service against me. He knew exactly what he was doing. He took the last years of my life, the years I was supposed to spend with my wife's memory and my children's company, and he turned them into a struggle for survival. I watched Julian. He wouldn't look up, but I could see his jaw tight, a muscle in his cheek pulsating. He was hearing the truth, and for the first time, he couldn't laugh it off as a joke among friends. Arthur Vance stepped down from the stand, and the silence that followed him was heavy, almost suffocating. He didn't look back at the defendant. He didn't need to. He had spoken his truth, and in doing so, he had stripped away the last layer of Julian Sterling's protection. Julian was visibly trembling now. The perspiration was beaded on his forehead, and he was staring at his hands as if he didn't recognize them. He wasn't just a defendant anymore. He was a man witnessing the total obliteration of his own identity. Thomas Greco took the stand next. He was 84, with the kind of hands that told a story of a lifetime of manual labor, hands that Julian had never known the hardship of, hands that had worked to build the very stability Julian had callously erased. Thomas didn't talk about money. He talked about his home, a small, modest house where he had raised his children and where his wife had passed away. He talked about the sense of betrayal that kept him awake at night, not because he was poor, but because he realized that the person who shook his hand and looked him in the eye was a snake in human skin. I sat on the bench watching the transformation of this courtroom. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was an exorcism. I saw the expensive suits of the defense team looking less like armor and more like a shroud. They were frantically whispering, passing notes, trying to find a path out of a forest that had already been set on fire. The senator was still there in the back, sitting as still as a statue, a man who had chosen his legacy over his kin, and the weight of that decision hung in the air, palpable and absolute. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice echoing in the chamber. Julian flinched, his head snapping up. He looked haggard, the polished veneer of his life stripped away by the raw, unfiltered dignity of the men he had robbed. "Do you have anything to say to Mr. Greco?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked around the room, desperately seeking a familiar face, a friendly nod, some scrap of the privilege that had cushioned his entire existence. But there was nothing, just the stern, unforgiving faces of the jury and the cold, unblinking glare of the public gallery. I never intended for them to be homeless," he stammered, the words hollow, insulting in their insufficiency. "It was an investment that went sideways. The economy did not force you to lie to veterans, Mr. Sterling." I cut him off, my tone dropping to that register I reserve for those who have finally run out of excuses. "The economy did not force you to use your name to bypass the morality that the rest of us abide by. Do not blame the market for your character failures." I turned to the jury. They were ready. The trial was accelerating toward its inevitable conclusion, the truth having acted as the ultimate accelerant. It was clear that the defense's strategy of minimizing the intent had failed, replaced by the crushing reality of a young man who had mistaken his surname for a license to destroy others. I watched as one of the jurors, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, leaned forward, her expression hardening. The connection had been made. The evidence wasn't just paper anymore. It was the story of 4 men who had been treated as disposable, and the man who had done it was now exposed in the harsh, unflinching light of the law. The assistant district attorney didn't let the silence hang for long. He knew he held the dagger. He walked to the prosecution table and pulled out a single, thin file, Exhibit 42. "Your Honor," he stated, his voice steady and clinical, "the state wishes to introduce a digital log recovered from the defendant's personal server. It is not an administrative record. It is a blueprint." The gallery shifted, a wave of anticipation crashing over the courtroom. Mr. Miller, Julian's attorney, was on his feet before the ADA could even finish the sentence. "Objection. Your Honor, that document was obtained via an overreach of the subpoena power. It is inadmissible." I didn't even blink. "Mr. Miller, sit down. Your client's digital footprints aren't privileged communication when they are used to execute a criminal conspiracy. The objection is overruled." The ADA walked to the projector. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what the defendant titled Operation Vulture." On the screen appeared a spreadsheet. It wasn't an investment fund. It was a list of names, the 4 veterans, each with their social security numbers, medical histories, and most chillingly, a vulnerability rating. Next to Arthur Vance's name, in Julian Sterling's own typing, were the words, "Easiest target, believes in family legacy, will sign anything if I mention his service record." The courtroom let out a sound I will never forget, a collective, sharp intake of breath, followed by a low, guttural murmur of disgust. This wasn't a business failure. This was a hunt. Julian had targeted these men, not just for their money, but because he thought they were too old, too trusting, and too proud to fight back. I looked at the screen, then at the defendant. Julian wasn't checking his watch anymore. He was staring at the words on the screen, his face drained of every drop of color. He looked like a man watching his own obituary being written in real time. The senator, in the back row, had stopped looking at the floor. He was looking at his nephew with a cold, hollow expression. The mask of the grieving relative was gone, replaced by the look of a man who realized he had unleashed a monster into the world. "Mr. Sterling," I asked, the silence of the room making my voice sound like a gavel strike. "You told this court your actions were a misunderstanding of market volatility. Is that still your position?" Julian couldn't look at me. He couldn't look at the screen. He just stared at the table, his world shrinking down to the cold reality of his own callousness. The defense had no move left. The game was over. Julian Sterling stood before me, the picture of shattered entitlement. Gone was the arrogant smirk, the sharp tailoring, the confident posture of a man who believed he was shielded by a family crest. He was, in this moment, nothing more than a common criminal who had preyed upon the weakest among us. The courtroom was pin-drop quiet, save for the rhythmic, steady breathing of the 4 veterans in the front row. They were not gloating. They were simply waiting. "Mr. Sterling," I began, my voice echoing off the high ceilings of the courtroom. "You came into this building believing that your last name was a permanent exemption from the consequences of your choices. You believed that the law was a flexible suggestion, something that could be bent or broken by a phone call from an uncle in the Senate. You were wrong." I paused, letting the weight of those words settle over him. In my courtroom, justice does not have a price tag. It does not look at the status of your family. It looks only at the facts. And the facts, Mr. Sterling, are that you are a predator who targeted men of honor to line your own pockets. You calculated their vulnerability, and you exploited it with a coldness that is frankly difficult to comprehend. The gallery watched him. He didn't have a defense attorney standing beside him now. Even Miller seemed to have distanced himself, keeping a professional, cold physical buffer between them. Julian looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine terror, not for his reputation, but for his future. "I am sentencing you to 10 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole, until full restitution, every penny, plus interest has been paid to Mr. Vance, Mr. Greco, Mr. Quiding, Miller, and Mr. Wright. You will also issue a formal, public apology to be published in every major newspaper in this state, in which you admit to your actions without reservation or obfuscation. My court is not a place for names, Julian. It is a place for the truth." The gavel came down. The sound was final, absolute. Officers moved to the defense table and handcuffed him. Julian didn't fight. He didn't argue. He simply let himself be led away, the clinking of the steel cuffs, the only music to his departure. I watched as the 4 veterans stood up. They walked out of the courtroom, not with the swagger of a victor, but with the quiet, unshakable peace of men who finally had their honor acknowledged. They had not been silenced by power. They had been vindicated by the law. I turned to the empty courtroom. Sometimes, the most powerful thing a judge can do is nothing more than let the system work exactly as it was designed to, without interference, without privilege, and without fear. People ask me why I stay in this work after so many years. It is for moments like this. Not for the spectacle, but for the quiet, necessary weight of justice finally finding its mark. The name Sterling would remain in the history books, but for Julian, it would no longer be a shield. It would be a reminder of the day his privilege crumbled under the weight of the truth. That is what justice looks like when it is working the way it was designed to work.